whether it is you or someone you love, anything can be overcome. And addiction does not define you. And it is just an experience. It's not an identity.
I truly believe that the way forward and to deep healing on a mass scale through our society is love. It's choosing love with ourselves. It's choosing love with those around us. And so whether you're experiencing addiction, whether someone you love is experiencing addiction, I encourage you to please always choose love.
Welcome home to the Loving Consciously podcast. My name is Amaris.
And my name is Eric.
And if you are like us, nobody taught you how to love.
We are best friends and life partners here to vulnerably and authentically share our 7-year journey to unconditional love.
Our mission is to help you learn how to love consciously in all of your relationships so we can journey together towards a more effective, intentional, and fulfilling way of giving and receiving love. Loving consciously.
Together, we have overcome neurodivergence, mental health, addiction, pregnancy loss, infidelity, and grief. After 6 years, the lack of knowledge on how to heal or love each other through these challenges led to our separation.
After us both spiritually awakening and recommitting, we built our new conscious partnership founded on unconditional love and a commitment to personal growth.
Thank you for joining us as we put it all out there to show you the duality of our love's pain and beauty.
And remind you that you have both the capacity to love consciously and the power to always choose love. Namaste, and welcome back to the Loving Consciously podcast. This is episode 18, titled Loving Through Addiction. We are so excited to be here with you today. We are coming to you from the Petrified Forest in Arizona, our last stop here before we move on to New Mexico tomorrow. Today's topic of addiction is something that is really near and dear to our hearts and has greatly impacted both of our lives and our relationship. This is going to have 3 distinct parts to this episode. In the first part, we are going to talk about the truth about addiction, in which we are going to discuss the reality that almost every single person on this planet, or a large majority of them, are addicted to something, even if it's their ego and suffering. In the next part, we are going to share our personal stories of our journeys with addiction. And then in the last part, we are going to talk about loving through addiction, loving yourself, be it through your own addiction or as you navigate someone else's, and loving people who may be experiencing that challenge in their lives. How can we effectively love ourselves and others, and what does healthy movement through and out of this experience look like? So let's get into it. The first part here is talking about the truth about addiction. And I want to pause here and preface that if this is really near and dear to your heart and this topic really speaks to you, I did an episode on my solo podcast, the podcast, titled Truth About Addiction, where I go much deeper into what we're about to share here. I welcome and invite you to listen to that either now or after this episode. It's a really great deep dive into this topic. The truth about addiction is we're all addicts. In some way, in some form, at some point in our lives, I would argue, and I personally believe, most people are addicted to something. We live in a time where the world is consumed with an epidemic of addiction, whether it is drugs, alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, porn, video games, food, suffering, ego, identities, stuff, consumerism, escapism. People are addicted. And it's really interesting because most people, a lot of people, view addiction as this thing that occurs outside of themselves, or as this thing that is someone who's, addicted to hard drugs, or maybe those more visible and obvious addictions. And before we get really deep into this, I really want to encourage you all to sit with this and ask yourself what in your life you may have an unhealthy relationship with, and how addiction or addictive behaviors have manifested in your life before.
Yeah, thank you for encouraging people to take a look at that, because addiction can be a sneaky thing. Sometimes it's very in our face. Hey, I'm doing this and it's causing me harm. It's causing harm to the relationships that I have with people around me. And sometimes it's sneakier than that. It's causing harm to you and yourself. And when we outsource our happiness or use other things to escape negative emotions or uncomfortable feelings within ourselves, it leads to suffering.
Absolutely. And the flip side of this is it's not always doing harm. I have had periods of my life where I was a very functioning addict. And there are lots of people who have a deeply unhealthy relationship with alcohol or are addicted to nicotine or food or whatever it may be. And it's not necessarily quote unquote harming their life in a visible way. And it's obviously harming their health and maybe harming their finances or their spiritual well being. But addiction isn't always this big, black, ugly disease that destroys your entire life. And I think that that is where our view as a society of addiction is right now. We only really recognize it as addiction and treat it as addiction when it's this like illegal, destructive reality. And the reality of addiction is it's not always destructive to life. However, it's still harmful. And so, really just want to start kind of getting people thinking and getting people going, and changing our views of addiction, because obviously the way we're viewing it as a society isn't working. We're not winning this battle. It's plaguing, it's plaguing everyone. And so, how can we look at this differently? And I really think if we can start to allow the perspective that we're all addicts in our own way, whether it's to an unhealthy behavior or a substance or something else. And it's not always this big destructive thing. If you are an alcoholic and you are fully functioning and hold your job and don't get arrested and don't, drink and drive, that's great. And that's still addiction.
The thing about addiction is that when we start entering that state of addictive tendencies, we do that because at some point, whatever is the fuel for our addiction, right? Whatever we are utilizing as that focus gave us a positive return. It was either a dopamine hit or filled a hole that was in ourselves that we weren't filling for ourselves. It could be used for numbing out negative experiences. These things start positive, right? And the addiction really happens when we utilize positive things in our life in an abusive way to excess, to really form an unhealthy relationship where we are now dependent on that thing for whatever we were coming to it for.
Absolutely. And I think the really important call out before we move on to this next section here, sharing our stories, is the purpose of this. While it may feel uncomfortable and it may feel foreign, and you may not agree with this, and that is completely okay, the purpose here is to start shifting our perspective. If we can all collectively agree that we all at least have this capacity within us, but that we all have had unhealthy relationships with things at times, and that we all in some way have been addicted to something at some point, then we can just completely come to the table together as a collective humanity, as one big family, and have a different conversation without the shame, without the guilt, without the judgment, without the projections and all the ego and the fear. That's the intent here, is to get all of that out of the way by laying this groundwork of, hey, we've all been there. We're all addicts. We all have the potential to be addicts in some way. And accepting that possibility, even just possibility, and not treating addiction as this thing that's like outside of us and happens to other people and is wrong or bad or, something to be judged, is the starting point for moving through healing.
Yeah, and addiction isn't an identity, right? It's an experience. And when we can all accept the potential for that experience in our life, we open the door, we open our hearts to be able to heal that part. One of the biggest obstacles to healing is denial. Whenever we deny a behavior within ourselves, we have the potential then to deny that in other people. We prevent healing in our journey, and we prevent healing from others. It's important to keep our minds and our hearts open to how these experiences are manifesting in our life so that we can address them, whether that is heavy substance abuse, whether that is pornography, whether it's even just an unhealthy addiction with social media or something as simple as Netflix.
It's very vast, and I think you could be addicted to anything, right? So moving on here, now that we've kind of laid a little bit of the groundwork of this interesting and I think revolutionary perspective that we share, we are going to share individually each of our journeys with addiction. And we've talked a lot about your journey on this podcast. I don't think listeners have been as privy to my journey with addiction. If you're not a listener of my solo podcast, you may not have heard that story. And so I'm going to go through as high level as I can, but to give you enough detail and perspective of how drastically addiction has impacted my life and how I have absolutely and completely transmuted that experience in my life. To be able to say that is such a blessing and it's such a gift. And it's not something I take lightly to sit here and have over 9 years clean and to have overcome all of my vices and addictions. And so I share this story with the hope and intention that whether it is you or someone you love, anything can be overcome. And addiction does not define you. And it is just an experience. It's not an identity. And something I'm really passionate about is not only eliminating the stigma and guilt and shame, but eliminating the label of addict, of calling people an addict. You are not an addict, you are experiencing addiction. When you start to label it as who you are, it really deeply impacts your psyche. And as someone who spent many, many, many years of inner work and counseling and spiritual work and recovery, trying to unwire that thinking, I just want to start with that gem. So my journey with addiction has spanned most of my life. I was born into a family where there is a lot of addiction. Alcoholism is very prevalent on one side of my family. And one of my parents was an active addict growing up and all throughout my life. And I was really deeply impacted by that as a child. I remember, being very young, 6, 7 years old, and seeing this person intoxicated, seeing this person going through, losing jobs and getting arrested and all of the things that come with addiction. And that set a really big tone for me. And it's really interesting because I did not enter the world of addiction or even drugs and alcohol until I was 19. I, as a teenager, I just wasn't that person. And I don't know if that was because I had that experience with my parent. Those things just didn't call to me. I saw the great suffering that they brought on me and on my family and on my parents. And so for me personally, I just never really went into that. My 19th birthday, I could count on one hand how many times I had drank. I think I had used marijuana once, and I hadn't used any other substances at all. And so for me, my addiction started when I was 19, and I was coming out of a really big traumatic relationship, a core, high school sweetheart, engaged, several-year relationship that throughout the relationship became abusive and ended in a really toxic and abusive way. And so here I am at 19 years old. I found myself completely engulfed in suffering and trauma. And on my 19th birthday, I was with a friend and we were drinking. And I remember the moment distinctly of when I went from, I guess you could say, my normal state into quote unquote intoxication. And I remember the warmness and the calmness and the okayness that washed over me. And while that wasn't necessarily the start of my active dependency, it was definitely a key start of my addiction. From that point, I had about 6 months where I was partying. For me, that looked like MDMA and going to raves. The first time that I did that substance is when I personally say my quote-unquote addiction light switch turned on. I was at a festival and I was introduced to someone and I was given ecstasy or MDMA. I will never forget being in the crowd watching one of my favorite DJs at the time, and the what I say now is medicine. See, there's my mind now wanting to call it what I call it now. The medicine kicking in and feeling peace for the first time in my life. And from that moment, my addiction started and it was off to the races. And from that moment at 19 years old to my 21st birthday, so in about 2 years' time, I went from never really having done anything to being an IV meth and heroin user. So that is using needles. And it happened really quickly. I went from alcohol to within a few months MDMA to within a few months pills to within a month or two heroin, and then within a month or two of that adding meth, and then within a month or two of that needles. And it really quickly progressed for me. And I think it was all just my story and perfectly designed the way it needed to happen. I wouldn't change anything. But I'm able to kind of look back and see how unresolved trauma, mental wellness struggles, and environment was really contributing to this addiction. I would say causing it, frankly. I was incarcerated at 21. A few months after my 21st birthday, I was incarcerated in prison for 2 years. And I got clean when I got locked up. And I had about 5 or 6 months, and I actually relapsed in prison. And it was interesting because I was working a program and, really like happy to have this clean time. And my roommate, who I wasn't even close with, we didn't even really talk, offered me some Percocet pills, which is opiates, synthetic heroin, essentially. And I relapsed for a few weeks. And it was February 14th of 2015 is my clean date. So I just remember being in a visit, feeling like crap because I was, coming down / detoxing, and thinking, if I can't get clean in here, I may as well just die. There's absolutely no life to be living this way. And I felt so good and so proud of the time that I had. And I just made a decision. I just made a decision one day that was not going to be my life. And I never looked back. And here we are 9 years and just under a month later. And when I got out of prison, I did the whole 12-step recovery thing for a little while, couple years, and then there just came a point where it didn't resonate anymore. And I look back now from this level of consciousness, and I can see that it was because that thinking of once an addict, always an addict, you can never heal this, and you're never going to be able to use anything, and if you have, you've relapsed, that didn't work for me. Because at that time, I never had an issue with alcohol. I never even really drank. And I didn't really see how medicinal marijuana at the time, but really any plant medicine now, was the same thing as using meth and heroin. I decided to leave the program, and I haven't actively been in any type of recovery or 12-step program for many years. That was kind of the end of my addiction story, I thought. Until I got more consciousness and got much older, I realized through nicotine, which was a severe addiction for me. This wasn't like something I did a little bit. Nicotine controlled my life. I will get really vulnerable and personal here. I would bathe with it. I would have it on the toilet. I would have it while we were being intimate. I would sleep with it. I would drive with it in my hand at all times. And to share a really powerful story here, I was in Vegas in a nightclub, pretty intoxicated a few years back, and I dropped my vape, and the cartridge with juice went flying across the dance floor in a nightclub in Vegas, which if you've never been in a nightclub in Vegas, they're massive. It's chaos. There's hundreds of people. And I was on the floor in heels and dress searching for that vape pod for a long time, and then waited until the club closed and everyone left to continue to search for it. Nicotine ran my life, and I was not okay without it. I was constantly the one running outside to vape all the time, sneaking the vape in bathrooms, sneaking the vape, you name it, in airplanes. It didn't matter. It was really, really all-consuming for me. I realized through that, when my spiritual journey got really intense, that I had a problem, and that I claimed to be free of addiction, and yet here was this acceptable addiction, right? All my friends are doing it. Vape is everywhere, right? Nicotine's everywhere. I am not smoking. All those same rationalizations. And for me, it came down to, it was last January 29th. So I have about a year and almost 2 months without nicotine. I was on vacation. We were in, I think, Jamaica on that 3-week trip we've talked about. And I just woke up one day and decided, nope, I am not going to give my power to this anymore. I love myself too much. I am far too powerful of a spiritual being to continue to give my power to nicotine. And so I don't care what I have to do and how uncomfortable it is. I'm never going to give my power away to anyone or anything ever again. And I never looked back. And here I am over a year later, completely free of that. I have not had cravings for 9, 10, I don't even know how many months. It is not something that even exists in my world. And it actually bothers me now when I'm around other people who are doing it. So that has been my journey with addiction. It was very much familial, and then heavy substance use addiction, and then nicotine addiction. And now for this last, year and a couple of months, I have really been transmuted of this and free of this experience. And it's been such a long and beautiful journey for me. It's been challenging. There have been many phases of my journey with experiencing and overcoming addiction. And I sit here today with all of the confidences saying, I am not an addict. I don't identify with those labels. I am not experiencing addiction. That trauma and that pain and those shadows have been deeply transmuted in my life at this time. And I'm just incredibly grateful for that. And so that's my story. I'm going to pass it out to you. Yours is a little bit different than mine.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's really been a beautiful opportunity to watch you grow over the years that we've been together and to transmute the addictive tendencies in your life and learn to love yourself on deeper levels by not giving your power away to these things anymore. And I've seen an amazing change in you. It's completely impacted your life. It's impacted this relationship, our family, and it's a testament to truly what is possible and the power that we have in the decisions that we make for ourselves. You said it so effortlessly in that I made a choice. This is not going to rule my life anymore. And the reality is that it is that simple.
It is. And while it's incredibly simple, it is very challenging. And I want to save space for that because it was one of the core biggest challenges of my life, of my suffering, of my ego. And I think a major lesson that I was here to learn. And so very simple, yet very challenging. And I also just want to say thank you. I received that love and those reflections. You've had such a unique lens into my journey and seen so many different phases throughout the last almost 8 years together. I also want to just share with people, if my very high level story in any way resonates, inspires, or calls to you, I go really deep on my podcast about my life journey and the things I'm going through and addiction and mental health and all of the parts that have been woven into my story from this. So that's always there as a resource as well.
It's so interesting because both of our journeys to addiction are very different. Mine was very much a slow burn that actually started very young as behaviors that kind of escalated over the years. They started off innocent. They started off as small ways to regulate myself, and over time it became unhealthy dependencies. And it wasn't until I was much older that I realized that these seeds of addictive behaviors had been planted very, very young. For me, it started with video games. It started with masturbation, and then an unhealthy relationship with pornography, which escalated into infidelity in our relationship on multiple accounts. And at the core of this, for me, was this wound around self-love and belonging. As a young kid, I would utilize video games as a way to escape. I had trouble connecting with other people, and so I felt safe embodying the character of somebody that wasn't in this world and experiencing what I was experiencing, right? I could experience something else through the nature of that video game, and thus escaping my uncomfortable reality, not knowing how to connect with people at the time, not knowing how to love myself and be okay with who I was. Video games really rapidly became a way for me to just unplug from the world. I would spend days playing them, way more than what was healthy. And I found that through doing that and spending my time and energy playing video games rather than being out and facing the uncomfortability of socializing with people, I was further perpetuating that problem because I wasn't willing to step out into the uncomfortableness. The thing about video games and really any addiction that we have where we give our power away to something else is that it's a band-aid solution. And those band-aids lose their effect over time. That can look like more of the same addiction or branching out into other addictions to essentially look for what we were looking for in the original addiction that didn't get fulfilled. These are all just cover-ups to emotions within ourself and energy that needs to be resolved. And until we resolve that energy for ourselves, the addictions will keep manifesting, whether it's of the same form or of a different form. For me, that looked like turning to sexual gratification and masturbation. That feeling of uncomfortableness and not knowing how to connect with others in a social manner really came to a head during my maturity, in which everybody started pairing off in relationships. When that began to happen, the inability for me to connect then transmuted into a romantic form. And so because there was that need and that love that I wasn't giving myself at the time, I started searching for that love in the gratification of an orgasm, which in my mind at the time computed to connection, right? Human connection. The use of pornography was a way to be able to control that connection with others in a safe space without needing to make myself uncomfortable by putting myself out there. One, because I didn't like who I saw in the mirror. And so because I couldn't love myself, I didn't have the capacity to turn around and love others, be myself. And then the more that I hid from that, it was, okay, let's get that connection dopamine hit from pornography and masturbation. And that became, around fourth grade for me, fourth or fifth grade, a regular occurrence, to where I was masturbating 3, 5, or more times a day and injuring myself physically in the pursuit of that connection and that feeling of energetic release, which I associated with love and connection and wholeness. Because it was seeded so early, both the video games and the pornography and masturbation addictions, they were part of my normal existence. And so there was a big blind spot to me in terms of how these things were really affecting my life. It wasn't until these seeds started sprouting as an adult and manifesting in our relationship romantically, Amaris and I, that I started understanding, oh, there's deeper problems here. Frankly, I was in denial. And it wasn't until I stopped utilizing these things to escape and I sat with the uncomfortability of the situation, knowing that I hurt my partner deeply, hurt myself deeply, and hurt those around me deeply, that a change was able to happen. I realized that I was experiencing sex addiction at the age of 26. It was December of 2022. And the process of accepting that I was experiencing addiction and then beginning to dive deeper into why it had manifested, how this thing showed up in my life that I didn't even realize was impacting me so much. It was by sitting with these uncomfortable experiences, right? Whenever I would have an urge to go watch pornography or to play video games, taking that brief second and asking yourself, why do I want to do this right now? It gave so much clarity and a roadmap to the things within myself that were not healed, that I was withholding from myself, the self-judgments, the shame. And shame was another big addiction for me, actually. Once I became aware of it and the presence of it in my life, it was much easier to tackle, because then I knew the beast that I was fighting, rather than chasing myself in circles, following the stories of the ego and saying, no, you need this to be happy, you need this to be happy, and running that rat race with the carrot dangling in front of your face. When you say, no, enough is enough, I'm never going to get that carrot, because the carrot is not outside of me, it's inside of me. And when we start to look inside, looking for that carrot, that's where the real healing starts to happen.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing all of that. That was a beautiful and vulnerable share of your story, and you've, touched on it at some points throughout this podcast, but not that deeply. So thank you for that. Something that was at the end there I want to give a little more space to was you were addicted to shame. And some people may have heard that and had massive aha moments, and some people may have not even really thought about it at all. You can be addicted to emotions. And that's what I mean when I say addicted to suffering. I'm using this all-encompassing umbrella in term. Suffering can look like a lot of different things for a lot of different people. I was addicted to anger. And how can someone be addicted to emotions? Well, when you experience an emotion, a physical change happens. And so when you experience that emotion a lot, and the physical change that happens is in some way gratifying, over time, you become physically dependent or reactive to that emotion. All these different chemicals being released. And, for you, when you would experience shame, I could see on your face, it was like you had taken a drug, and that feeling of shutting down and being able to be like, nope, I'm just going to go into shame and disconnect and detach from this reality was like an addiction for you. And for me, anger. When I would get really angry, it was all consuming, and it was like a high. It's a rush, it's adrenaline. And I remember when I realized, oh wow, I'm like addicted to this, because I was starting to like crave being angry in the way I would crave drugs or nicotine. And so you absolutely can be addicted to emotions. And I really love that you brought that, because I don't think that's a very common narrative. And so I would encourage people to think about that as well, of, if there may be an unhealthy relationship with an emotion in your life.
Yeah, and you touched on something really important too, which is the state change. Because that is really the seed of the addiction. It's not the thing that we're searching for. It's not the pornography, it's not the drug or whatever it may be. It's the way that it makes us feel. It's the way that it changes our state. And so when we get addicted to that state change, and we essentially tell ourselves that the only way that we can get to that state is through that thing, right there is where the addiction happens. When we can understand truly that we have the power to get to any state without anything but ourselves, the addiction is broken. Because that's the truth. You have the power to get into any state that you want, truly, only by the power of your thoughts. And a download that came to me recently was my own dependency and addiction to self-destruction. This very recently, within the last couple weeks actually, was this realization that I had a tendency to self-destruct even after all this growth. Even after everything that we've overcome, there was still this behavior pattern of self-destructing. It was through analyzing with inquiry, why is this happening? Through the action of addiction, I was actively self-destructing. We had just experienced conflict. In that space in between of reflection, I began to realize, oh, when we are in a state of conflict, my presence is brought in. My protector mode comes in. That divine masculine energy is activated. And by recognizing, post-conflict, I'm feeling this way. Pre-conflict, I didn't feel connected to my masculine energy. I am using conflict to bring myself into a state of my masculine energy, because that is where I feel the most in the element and able to protect, provide, and be of service. Creating the problem, providing the solution. Rather than recognizing, oh, okay, I'm achieving that state through this thing. Let's just take out the middleman, right? Because clearly I can get to that state. It's possible. I've done it. And clearly I was in the prior state before, because that's where I was living. So how do I get from point A to point B on my own? And you sit with that.
Yeah, that is such valuable insight. And I am still blown away and still processing the profoundly deep revelation that you had that day, and like how incredibly big that shadow work is. Like, that's deep stuff. This is really truly the work that we are doing on the day to day, all the time. It's always continuing. And so now, even with 9 something years on my part, or a year nicotine, we don't even count our time. You've got somewhere in the realm of a year, maybe, give or take. Yeah. And honestly, we don't really count. So it's like we don't even really know. But even with all of that time, we're still having massive revelations. One that I shared about on my podcast was about realizing through a beautiful friend of mine that heroin was a medicine. It's still opiates, opium, right? And that though it was in an unhealthy frame of consciousness, I was using this thing as a medicine, because at that time I could not mentally, emotionally, physically, or spiritually handle processing through the trauma. My body wasn't upgraded enough for it yet. I didn't have the tools yet. I didn't have the skills yet. That, for whatever reason, it wasn't the right time. And so I used this tool, albeit in an incredibly unhealthy and unnatural way, as a means for my addiction. And so just really want to honor and call out that the work keeps going. You keep learning more and more, and you just visit these with higher states of awareness. And a couple of other things I wanted to touch on here was this concept that we were just talking about of being addicted to suffering, because it's a huge part of my journey, and it's something I'm really passionate about, and it's something that I really believe is a huge core problem inflicting humanity right now. And we are, like, collectively as a species addicted to the suffering. Like, we're addicted to the chaos, and it's so normal, and it's so tolerated in so many ways. And for me, I was just, my whole life was trauma and chaos and change and pain, and that just became normal. And especially if you are a child, like most people are, who grew up in any way that wasn't perfect and normal, whatever that is, with any type of conflict with your parents, death in your life, like grief journeys, any addiction in families, any abuse, be it physical, sexual, emotional, verbal, neglect, etc., whatever that may be, that forms your brain. Your young brain and your young nervous system is learning to be comfortable in that, and is learning that that's the normal state. And so that's really this addicted to suffering. And that looks like many things for many different people. For us both, it looked like escapism. And we use this word a lot, at the height of our unconsciousness, at the height of our escapism. And essentially what that means for us is, at the height of our unconsciousness, not being spiritually awake, not being aware of our spiritual nature, not being aware of really anything other than our ego, right? Conscious to the ego. And then at the height of our escapism, for us, that was shopping. We had a big spending problem. We loved to go out, like, constantly, like every night after work, going out and shopping. It looked like going out and partying, drinking, and really painful to look at now, escapism days. It looks like a lot of different things, and jointly together, getting off work and being so fried and unable to face the reality of both of our internal sufferings and what was going on in our relationship, that we would just, take some cannabis, drink a couple beers, and watch Netflix from 5 p.m. to midnight every night after work. And so it looked like a lot of different things, and it can look like a lot of different things for you. And so I share that to just kind of show, we can be addicted to suffering, and we can also be, our egos, really, not we, but our egos can be addicted to things too. And so it's all this really complex web of unhealthy behaviors, and bringing light and consciousness to the ways that addiction can manifest, and that it's so much more than just like, I'm addicted to a drug and I can't stop. It's just so much more complex than that. The last thing I wanted to touch on, and we'll get into our last section here, is, you were talking, and I know this story, and I've known this story for a while. I knew about some of this, but I didn't know about 90% of it until a year ago. I had no clue you were a sex addict. I knew there was unhealthy behaviors happening with like the infidelity, and dishonesty was another one that wasn't mentioned. I did not know the depths of the porn addiction and when it started. And I've known it for over a year now, and as you were talking, I just really like internalized that fourth or fifth grade is single digits. That's like what, 8 or 9 years old? Like, that's so young. And also to get people to see that children can be addicted to things. And I think that we don't look at that as a society holistically, the potential that children can be addicted to things, whether they're addicted to their whoopee, whether they're addicted to video games, whether they're addicted to a behavior or an emotion, that can also happen. And part of this conversation and part of changing the narrative and healing addiction in our collective is understanding that this is a human problem, not an adult problem, and that this can happen in our kids. And so being mindful and being aware of those unhealthy behavior patterns, because they have the potential to continue to grow and escalate. And, you know, for me, I look back being a child, and I absolutely had unhealthy behaviors or a quote unquote addiction to escapism. That was something that was always there. I lived with my headphones in, I lived in my room. I would obsessively, uncomfortably think about all day just getting home and going and escaping in my room so I didn't have to be around anyone. I used things, be it music or relationships or sex or masturbation as well, for me, really young. I started masturbating at like, I don't know, 5 years old, 3 years old. I don't know how young I was, but that, as I've shared on my podcast, was a result of, you know, childhood sexual abuse. And so for me, I was really young, but I would use all of these things to not feel emotions, because there was a lot of active and unhealed trauma going on in my young life. I did not have the tools or support or reality to deal with that at that time. And so I would use TV and emotions and relationships and all these things I mentioned to escape having to feel things. And so I can even see those unhealthy behaviors with making myself feel better through something other than myself as early as 3, 5 years old, and pretty much consistently up until it manifested in substance use. And that is one thing I shared about earlier, is trying to rewire that common perspective that addiction looks like hard drugs, or addiction looks like this thing. Addiction is very, very deep. It's very insidious, and it's very sneaky. Like you said, addiction can look like using a person or thing or emotion to not have to feel what you're feeling or to feel a desired feeling. And so I would encourage people to be really on guard, because when we're dealing with ego and addiction and consciousness in this journey, it is very vast, it's very gray, and it really can sneak up to, like you said, waking up at 26 years old and only realizing, because your entire life imploded, oh my gosh, I'm a sex addict. Like, I'll never forget, or my moment when I realized, oh my gosh, I'm as or more addicted to nicotine than I was to heroin. It's the same thing. I've just deluded myself that this is acceptable because it's legal and everybody's doing it. And I will never forget the first time that you called me and told me that you went to SAA and that you thought you were a sex addict. Like, it was so far out of what my mind could have perceived. And now I look back, of course, and I'm like, oh my gosh, like catching, you know, hiding in the bathroom all the time. And just, I mean, all the things made sense. I never would have conceived sex addiction. It is one of the more taboo ones. And so is things like food and video games and porn. And so I encourage people to like sit with and understand that it can be very hidden. And so it's very easy to be like, no, not everyone's an addict. I know hundreds of people who aren't an addict. Well, these things can hide in the dark.
Thank you for sharing that. It's important that we bring our awareness into our addictive tendencies, because where we put our awareness is where the healing can happen. And these addictions and patterns within ourselves thrive in the shadow. The minute we pull them out of the shadow and into the light, they go from being a negative behavior pattern that leads to suffering to a roadmap to healing. Because these addictions if you follow them down to their core, if you ask yourself the right questions, they will tell you exactly what it is that you are perceiving within yourself that is lacking, that you don't like, or that you would like to change. And then when you address those wounds, the addiction stops.
That is such a good point, and I could do an entire TED Talk on this, but something that I have really come to realize is it's not an addiction to the drugs at all. The drugs are not the problem. And that is my personal issue with 12-step programs, is they come down to this core of like, you are an addict, and so like you're always going to be that way, and the drug is the problem, when in reality, when I healed my mental wellness and got my mental state to a somewhat semi-normal for me, I don't like that word, but I don't know how else to describe it. When I mentally and emotionally and spiritually and physically healed and wasn't living in a constant state of trauma and somatically started to release that stored in my body trauma, I no longer had a problem with anything. And addiction and those tendencies and all the things like literally disappeared from my life. It just doesn't exist in my reality today. I have such a healthy relationship with things in my life now. I just wanted to save space for, it's really about addressing the core wound, and that fundamentally is one of the biggest issues with mainstream treatment and view on addiction. Is we are trying to treat the addiction, the drug problem, the alcohol problem, right? Go to AA, go to rehab. We are not getting down deeper to the core of what is actually causing that. And then people, the next layer down is mental health, right? Oh, well, you have depression, you have anxiety, and then it's pills or therapy. We're still, and I have another episode of Truth About Mental Health that makes the same argument of, we're still not getting deeper. That's the issue, is we're not going deep enough. It's not, I'm having a problem with heroin because I have depression, so I need antidepressants and therapy. It's, I'm having a problem with heroin and I'm having depression because I have unhealed sexual childhood abuse that is stored energetically in my body. And in my experience, I found the deeper and deeper we go, the more clear the answers become, and the more we realize, oh, it was never about the drugs. It was never about the porn or the video games or the nicotine. I can put anything in that blank. People, emotions, substances, experiences, shopping, you name it. I've had an unhealthy relationship with many, if not most, things in my life at some point. I was just addicted to not feeling what I was feeling, and I was just addicted to feeling better.
That was very powerful. Thank you for sharing. Thank you so much for sharing that. Before we get into our final section here, I want to save space for, while this is a simple one-step decision, like you said, it's not an easy one. And the journey to recovery, which is possible, you can recover. You have it within you, I promise you. That journey is a difficult one, I won't lie. And sometimes it can feel like death, because in reality, it is death. It's death to that version of you that's living in suffering. It's death to the ego and being a slave to the mind and what it tells us will bring us happiness. When we choose to give up that safety net, it's like giving up your favorite stuffed animal, that thing that made you feel safe as a kid. As we get older, it's not that stuffed animal anymore. It's whatever the substance of our addiction is. And when we have the strength to let go of that, we can find wholeness within ourselves. And the most important thing that you can do for yourself throughout this journey is to have grace, is to love yourself through it, and to recognize that this growth is not a linear journey. Taking steps backward is not always taking a step backward. So long as you bring your presence and your awareness to everything that you're doing, you are never moving back. You're gaining a better and deeper understanding of yourself. Relapse happens. If we feel shame with that relapse and we start judging and criticizing ourselves for it, it will almost always lead us deeper and back to the addiction. When we can love ourselves unconditionally and say, okay, I'm feeling this craving, this urge, this trigger. I'm going to fulfill it, and I'm going to bring my awareness as I fulfill it through this on a couple of different aspects. One, why am I doing this? Let me be completely aware of that. Okay, let me love myself enough to allow myself to receive that during this time through this action of participating in the addiction. And then let me forgive myself. Because the minute that you forgive yourself, you release yourself from the guilt. The ego and the mind no longer has power over you to throw that relapse back into your face to send you back to the addiction. You use it as a learning experience to dive deeper, to do better next time. And through that, you slowly claw your way out of the bucket. Just remember, love yourself through it, love your loved ones through it, because it is a very difficult journey. It is a metamorphosis of changing from who you are at an unconscious level to healing. If you look at any imagery in society about what that healing journey typically looks like, you can see this theme of death and rebirth, right? The phoenix that has to burn itself up to become something beautiful.
That's also true. I'm so kind of speechless sitting here listening to you, because I forget sometimes how recent this is, like a year and a half ago, and how far you've come. And you were someone who really used your relapses and used those time periods to grow and introspect, and I really admire that. Another thing you were saying that was really impactful to me was this concept of death and it feeling like death. And it feels like death, y'all. And for me, breaking that addiction consciously happened by almost death. And what I mean is something I share in my story and in my intro of my podcast even, is my addiction to suffering had gotten so deep, and my addiction to those emotions, I wasn't even aware of it. And then when I lost my father and went through a lot of those really traumatic losses that year, that suffering no longer made me feel better. And so suddenly these emotions, this escapism, this whatever it was that I was using up until this point unconsciously for years to make me feel better, arguably my whole life, like your shame and video games and masturbation, that didn't make me feel better anymore. So now both options made me feel like shit. And then things got really dark, and I just spiraled into deep suicidal ideations, and leading to the night where I put a loaded gun to my head in front of you. And I was just so consumed with the suffering. And it was in that moment and through that experience of almost quote unquote physically dying that I realized it was like death, and I needed to kill those parts of myself, and that there was literally no other way than to move through this and to feel the feelings. I could no longer use anything, right? Like I couldn't use drugs because I've overcome that addiction. I couldn't use, escapism or these emotions because now I'm suffering. All of my tools had been exhausted. And so it all had to die. The I that I thought I was or perceived to be at that time had to die. And my concepts of addiction had to die. And so it just became the only choice that I had at that point, and this is 2021, I realized that the only choice was to do the work, feel the feelings, let that shit out. There was no more avoiding. I could no longer deny, suppress, and ignore and escape my childhood trauma. I could no longer lie and condone and make excuses for, it's nicotine's legal, or this thing, or this emotion, or relationships, or whatever it was. I could no longer deny it. It was so clear as day to me that I was going to have to go through this process. And so for me, it was kind of a metaphorical death, if you will. And it really is like constantly killing this old version of yourself and leveling up. And then you level up and you have more awareness, and you go back down deeper into the trenches and revisit that addiction with higher awareness. And so you never overcome that thing or that trauma. It's always there. You just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And the cool part about it is the farther and farther you get in that journey, it goes from being excruciatingly uncomfortable to really freaking cool. Now we have these revelations around our addictions or our unconscious days or suffering or whatever it was, and we are like, wow, that's profound, that's so cool, let's talk about it. Like, I want to go deeper. Whereas before it was like, oh my god, I don't want to face this. Now it's like, wow, this is really profound shit, and I want to share this with the world for hope and for support and insight. And so I hope sharing our stories here today has given you some of that. And now we can go ahead and get into how to love through this. This will be pretty brief. I think we've talked about a lot of this stuff, but it's these two core concepts of loving yourself and how do you love people who are going through this experience, which is a lot of people. And for self-love, I'm actually today, at the same time as this episode, releasing an episode titled All Love is Self-Love, and talking about self-love and my journey to self-love, if you'd like to check that out. But really with self-love, it really just comes down to developing a healthy relationship with yourself. We can sit here and list 1,000 things. I'm going to give you all the answer. I'm going to give you the spark notes here. It's developing a healthy relationship with yourself. Emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, technically, financially. It's developing a healthy relationship. And I prefer to focus on the positive rather than you need to stop the drug, you need to stop this, you need to take this away, take that away. It's not about taking things away. It's about adding the self-love. And when the self-love is there, like the day that I gave up my vape, the addiction is gone. The need is no longer there for that thing. So when it's there or that craving comes up or it's presented to you, you realize, nah, I don't want that thing anymore. I love myself. And again, sounds really simple, but the core essence of it is developing that healthy relationship with yourself. While we're not going to do an entire episode on that at this time, that is something is my number one piece of advice when people come to me all the time over the years. Just, how did you do it? How do you stay clean? So my so-and-so is going through addiction. And now from this level of consciousness, I used to always say so many different things. From this level of consciousness now, I would say it's self-love. Like loving yourself and doing the work, doing the inner work and doing the healing to overcome and integrate and transmute your traumas. That takes away any possible reality for the need for unhealthy relationship with things.
Love is really always the answer. And when you love yourself enough, you don't want to hurt yourself. You don't want to participate in actions and activities that ultimately cause you harm. And so the first step is loving and accepting yourself. Because imagine that you're trying to fill a cup with water to drink, and you're using a cup with water that has a hole at the bottom. That symbolizes what we do with our addiction. We're trying to fill a glass that has a hole in the bottom, and no matter how much we fill it, no matter how much we add in, it will always continue draining out. Why? Because there's a leak. The start of this journey is plugging that leak. Love yourself enough and have the courage to do something different than your normal patterns. Find that hole that's within you, that thing that you are not giving to yourself. Is it self-love? Is it forgiveness? What is that for you? And then love yourself enough to give it to yourself. Love yourself enough to receive it from yourself. Have unconditional love with yourself so that, like you said, rather than focusing our attention on taking away the thing, we can put our attention on giving us the things that we actually need.
Yeah, so many of our episodes can correlate here, and we have episodes coming up too, like receiving love. We didn't forget about that one from a few episodes back. It's in our queue, where it'll kind of help support you. And that is what, my podcast, which I'm plugging like crazy today because it's so much a part of my story. It's a big part of my story. Addiction's a huge part of my story. And in my podcast, it's a lot more of a individual journey and individual coaching, whereas Eric and I focus on relationships and consciousness specifically and love. Those are our 3 topics. Mine is much more about like just spirituality and inner work. And I share this because this journey of self-love has been really my core essence journey for the last few years. And it's not just what is being released today in my episode on my Earth birthday, but it really is like such a massive part of my soul purpose and soul mission in my journey, is this journey to like deep, all encompassing self love. And so, if you're looking for support on that journey, if you are going through the experience of addiction in any capacity, or the experience of an unhealthy relationship, we can't even define where the line between unhealthy and addiction is. Any type of unhealthy anything, and you want to start working on that, that is a beautiful support and resource. And I would love to have you along to learn from some of the things that I've learned. Moving into this last piece here of outside of just self-love is, how do we love people who are going through this experience? And this is, again, something I'm really passionate about, because traditionally, especially in like the Al-Anons and just the general kind of societal view of addiction, we tend to look at it and say, oh, well, you don't want to enable them, or they need treatment, or they need 12 steps, or there's just a lot of like projecting and inserting what we think people need. And there isn't this like deep support and teaching around how to love somebody through addiction. And some things that come to mind for me is, first and foremost, it's loving them for the soul that they are. It's loving them for their essence, right? Like, we are not our behaviors, we are not our addictions, we are not our thoughts, our emotions, we are not any of that. We are all eternal spiritual souls having a human experience. And so when you can remember that and hold that in your awareness, it makes it much easier to separate the behavior or the experience or the actions or whatever it may be from the essence of the person that you love, your loved one, and who they are to their core, because they are not those things. So that would be my first piece of advice. The second key thing I really want to touch on is accountability. And I think we kind of get it a little bit right when people are like, oh, you don't want to condone it, or you don't want to enable them, right? And I am going to use different words. I don't personally love the word enable. The way that I have found really great success in looking at it is holding the mirror up and understanding that you can love that person, and it is not what's best for them to not hold them accountable for their behaviors. And so I see a lot in, society, and especially our friend group, prior to these last couple of years, of like, so and so has this problem, or like jokingly saying, oh yeah, I'm an alcoholic, or yes, that person, does this really incredibly unhealthy behavior. Like, yes, they're using a large amount of this substance regularly, but that's just them, or but it's not causing problems in their life, or whatever it may be. It is our duty as a humanity and as one big soul family here, I feel, to hold each other accountable. And it's something you don't see a lot of in. And I didn't really see it much at all, actually, ever in my existence until getting in the spiritual space. And honestly, y'all, even in the spiritual space, there's a lot of bypassing. And if you don't know what that word means, it just basically means not doing the work. And when we are not holding people accountable to their highest self, their highest standards, their highest love, and their highest truth, we are condoning that behavior. And so I would really encourage you to sit with how you show up for people in your life, because we are doing no favors for anyone and for this collective by not addressing these unhealthy behaviors in ourselves, and from a obviously loving and respectful way in our loved ones. And the other thing with that too is how you are looking at addiction, right? I see so often individuals outside on the streets experiencing houselessness. Please say houselessness, not homelessness. A house and a home are not the same thing. And what we would perceive to be experiencing addiction. And there's still so much judgment, and there's still so much rejection and projection and shame and guilt and all of these things around this. And it's like, when we are projecting that energy, everything's energy, frequency, and vibration, when we are projecting that out, of, ugh, look at that person, or ugh, that addict, or whatever it may be, like any type of negative reaction, number one, we are contributing that to the collective. And number two, it's a sign that there's something within us that we haven't accepted and integrated, or it's that rejection of that potential in ourselves. And that doesn't help the problem either. So we're all in this together. And those are my tips on how you can start to love people effectively who are going through this experience.
You hit on two really important topics. One is holding up the mirror, and two is unconditional love. When we see our brothers and sisters who are experiencing addiction with nothing but unconditional love, right? We release all the judgments, we release all the stories and the narratives that we are putting on their situation, and we see them for who they are as a soul. We love them. Whenever we judge somebody, we're really just judging that part in ourselves. And again, this goes back to all love is self-love. When you love yourself enough, you can see yourself in the experience of others. You can actually have true empathy. And there are ways of holding up the mirror, which many people do through judgment or through shame. There are ways of holding up that mirror through love. And that is truly how you love and support somebody who's experiencing addiction. It's holding up that mirror, not with judgment and not with shame, which is normal in our society today, but rather with love. It's saying, hey, I see you're experiencing this. How can I help? Encourage them to get to the root. Ask them the questions to open them up vulnerably. Love them enough to care and not see their behaviors and judge them, but rather see the pain that's beneath those behaviors, the suffering that they're experiencing, and help them out of that suffering. Love them like you would love yourself.
Love them like you would love yourself, because they are yourself. This has been really deep and powerful, and I really feel like a lot was channeled through this because I don't remember a lot of what we talked about. But I just want to say, as someone who has had immensely great, the majority of my life through both my family, myself, my romantic partners. I lost a romantic partner to an overdose. It's really deeply impacted my life. A large majority of my trauma in some way is tied back to addiction, and I've done a lot of work around it. And I think I said this a little bit earlier, but I'm going to echo this sentiment again of, you can recover. I am recovered. ED, past tense. You can recover. You are not these things. You are not defined by these things. And it really is as simple as making a choice. And I do not say that in a condescending way. I say that in a freedom and positive way from love of, you can make that choice at any moment. Whatever that thing or things, like you've heard with us, we had many, no judgment zone here. Whatever that thing or things is, it doesn't have to have power over you anymore. And you can survive without it. And as soon as you accept it, right? The first thing is like acceptance and awareness. As soon as you can accept, I have an unhealthy relationship with nicotine. I have an unhealthy relationship with alcohol, food, caffeine, coffee, porn, sex, love, intimacy, emotions, whatever it is. As soon as you can accept that, you can start to make a different choice. And the moment you make a different choice, you only need to make it one time. And then from then on out, it can be your new normal.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure talking about this topic that is so near and dear to our hearts, because so many of us experience it, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. I truly believe that the way forward and to deep healing on a mass scale through our society is love. It's choosing love with ourselves. It's choosing love with those around us. And so Whether you're experiencing addiction, whether someone you love is experiencing addiction, I encourage you to please always choose love. Always assume the positive. Always see the perfect human and soul that they are, because they're not in a place where they can see that in themselves. And the more that we can hold up the mirror with love, saying, this is who you really are, and encouraging them to look into it, the more we can love and heal each other. It's all about relationships. We're not here on this planet alone. We were not meant to do all these things alone. It's important to have community. It's important to be that community for others. We have a responsibility to love one another and to accept love from others. You can't have one without the other. Please go out and do both. We love you so much, and we're excited for what's to come.